we are bringing you another outstanding guest today. Brigadier General Yossi Kuperwasser is Director of the Project on Regional Middle East Developments at the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs, also known as JCPA, not JCPOA. I make that mistake, please don't. He is actively involved in organizations that support Israel and that work against anti-Semitism and anti-Israel initiatives. Cooper, as he is better known, is formerly the Director General of the Ministry of International Affairs and Strategy. He served as Assistant Defense Attaché for Intelligence at the Israeli Embassy in Washington. He was Intelligence Officer of the IDF Central Command, which is, I think, where we met about 100 years ago. And he held senior positions at the IDF Directorate of Military Intelligence, where he had a significant role not only in determining Israel's methods for coping with terror and regional developments, but also sharing them with the United States and other foreign partners of Israel to create regional security and international security. He has been a contributor to a wide variety of publications on the Middle East and on terrorism and on intelligence. And he appears in various Israeli and international newspapers and other media outlets. We were very pleased to have him in Focus Quarterly in the summer issue of 2020. You can find it there on our website. Before I turn the floor over to Yossi, which I'm going to do in a minute, here is your reminder. You are muted. You know you're muted. But it doesn't mean we don't want to hear from you in writing. If you have questions for our speaker, please use the Q&A function on Zoom. Yes, I know I say this every week, but there are still people who send us questions to the website. Please don't do that. Please send them to the Q&A function on Zoom, and we'll be happy to hear from you. At this time, Yossi Kuperwasser, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Shoshana, and it's a pleasure to be here again. And this time I was asked to speak about what's happening in our northern border following the attempt by Hezbollah on February 3rd to shoot down UAV, an Israeli UAV that was flying over Lebanon, collecting information that is necessary for us to know what is going on in our neighbor country. And what I wanted to focus on is the question of the rules of the conflict, or the rules of the game, as some people use this term, that are applied both in Lebanon and the other areas where we confront Hezbollah and Iran. Each one of these arenas has its own rules, and people most of the time respect those rules. And this situation, in a way, is not the best thing we can hope for, but it's something Israel can live with, because, as you know, since 2006, we were not exposed to any attempt to initiate a wide-scale war between us and the variety of elements that are operating in our northern border. And what we want is to postpone the next war as much as we can, and to make sure that if it erupts, we shall be victorious. But first of all, to postpone it, and to use the time in between wars in order to have an impact on the way the next war, when it happens, will be fought in a way that is acceptable for Israel. No wars is nice, but more acceptable. That's what's going on. So in Lebanon, the rules of the game are more problematic from an Israeli point of view. The rules are such that if Israel takes military action in Lebanon, the Hezbollah believes that it has the ability and the legitimacy to retaliate heavily, of course, depending on what Israel has done exactly. But basically, it can retaliate, and it should retaliate, because Hezbollah considers itself the shield of Lebanon. And as such, it has to protect Lebanon from an Israeli alleged intention to operate against Lebanon. And he is the one who stands between Israel implementing this intention and the damage that Lebanon can suffer if it happens. And because of that, it's extremely important for Hezbollah to play this game according to these rules. At the same time, Hezbollah knows that if he is going to carry out some operation against Israel, Israel's retaliation may be very harmful for Lebanon, and it doesn't want to turn into an explosives shield of Lebanon that would, by its own activity, cause severe damage to Lebanon. And because of that, it is very cautious not to carry out any operations against Israel. And that's how we managed for the last almost 15 years to maintain some sort of balance and quiet situation in Lebanon. That said, every side is preparing itself to the eventuality of war by doing two things. Israel collects information, and because of that, in this order, it has to fly over Lebanon and, of course, carry out other operations that enable it to have the information it needs. It has, for that purpose, to maintain its air superiority and air dominance over Lebanon. And that's why it insists on keeping the capability to fly over Lebanon to collect information. And especially since we are dealing with an enemy that understands the air superiority Israel has, and because of that, tries to put every asset it has in areas that are going to be difficult for Israel to hit from the air, and to hide everything they have, and they behave in a way that is non-military, so that it will be more difficult for Israel to find them. And of course, the crown jewel was the tunnels crossing from Lebanon to Israel that were built and digged through a long time to enable Hezbollah to carry out operations in Israel once a war erupts. And Israel had to learn about all these things and to maintain this intelligence and air dominance and air superiority throughout the years. And it was done mainly through the flights of the UAVs and the other aircraft over Lebanon that collected the information, the visual information that is so essential in order to be able to operate. It's of course not the only source. We have a variety of sources, but eventually this enabled Israel, whenever we thought that something is going in the wrong direction with the way Hezbollah is building their force, it was able for Israel to point at it and try to put pressure on Hezbollah to avoid moving forward in a direction we didn't want it to move, like the declarations of Prime Minister Netanyahu in the United Nations General Assembly about the special assets of Hezbollah in Beirut and so on and so forth, which caused a lot of damage to Hezbollah's effort to build its capabilities. So, and Hezbollah, on the other hand, is doing everything they can, as long as we don't take any action against them, to improve their capabilities. They have built amassed a huge amount of rockets, some of them, few of them, precisely guided, that are threatening Israel. And this enables Hezbollah, and especially Nasrallah, whenever he feels the need to threaten that he can hit Israel wherever he wants, whenever he wants. If anybody is going to harm Hezbollah or Lebanon, he's going to take this action because he has the capability. And we know that he has. And it's within this game, we are trying to improve our capability to prevent the damage that he can cause to us by improving our air defense, especially the anti-rocket capabilities. As you know, we have the Iron Dome and the Arrow and the David Sling and all kinds of weapons that we develop and keep developing in order to confront the threat coming from Hezbollah through its rockets. And it's an ongoing battle of learning between the two sides. We want to learn more about them. They want to learn more about how they can avoid our capability to hit them. And this is going on like that. And nobody uses force. So all of that is being done without using force, because if anybody uses force in Lebanon, there is, according to these rules of the game, the other side is allowed to take some sort of harsh retaliation, and nobody wants to go there. And as long as this is the case by both sides, nobody wants an escalation, we keep these rules of the game stable. That's being the case. Now, Hezbollah all of a sudden launches a missile and tries to interfere with our air superiority. So many people were opening their eyes wide and saying, what's going on here? And I was trying to also to understand what was happening. Is it a sign that Hezbollah is trying to change the rules of the game and is trying to prevent Israel from having this capability to fly over and collect information and so on? my first reaction to that was that it's probably not this case, because at least as long as this is only one case, it could have been that something special was happening with this specific intelligence collection mission that maybe was very close to something that was really very precious for Hezbollah, and they wanted to force us away from there or something like that. It's a place that was protected by air defense. That Hezbollah has it, but they don't use it very often, very rarely, as a matter of fact. So it's maybe we were close to something really sensitive, and Hezbollah was trying to defend it. Anyhow, it's already what, like 24 days since they did it. They never did it again. So I think that we can, as time goes by, get more and more the impression that it was not something that tells you that it's not a change of the rules, not an attempt to change the rules. Interestingly enough, this was probably also the understanding in the Israeli defense forces at the time, because there was no retaliation by Israel to this attempt to hit the UAV. And if Israel thought, or would have thought, that this is an attempt to change the rules of the game, I guess Israel would have taken some decisive steps to clarify its position about it. The fact that we did nothing indicates to me that the Israeli defense forces and the Israeli leaders were under the impression that, well, okay, we can tolerate that. It's not something really important. Anyhow, they didn't hit the UAV, and so we can continue with our activities. And as a matter of fact, at the same night, Israel attacked some targets in Syria, and there was a question whether this was a retaliation for what happened in Lebanon or not. And the answer is probably not, because it has to do with the rules of the game in Syria, to which I will refer in a second. But in the context of Lebanon, we have to remember that one of the reasons why the situation is vulnerable, is fragile, and can change, is that Hezbollah finds itself under a lot of pressure. The American sanctions over Iran, its patron, are still in place, in spite of everybody talking about the need to lift them. And this causes a lot of trouble to Hezbollah. And Hezbollah also suffers from a lot of inner criticism in Lebanon by everybody in Lebanon, including people from within the Shiite community who are unhappy with the way it operates, to the extent that somebody killed one of the critics of Hezbollah, Lokman Slim, in an operation that everybody blames Hezbollah for, and is very vulnerable right now because of this situation. And of course, the blame for everything in Lebanon goes to Hezbollah, like the repercussions and implication of the blast in the Beirut port. Even though Hezbollah claims that it had nothing to do with it, everybody believes he does. He's some way involved in this event. Whether it's true or not, nobody knows, but it doesn't matter. That's the common attitude to what happened, is that Hezbollah must be involved in that in some way or another. And since Hezbollah has become the state behind the state, not the state within the state, but the state behind the state. So actually, it controls Lebanon. Everything bad that happens in Lebanon, so many bad things are happening in Lebanon, affect its position inside Lebanon. It is under a lot of pressure. And Israel, of course, adds its own amount of pressure by saying that if Hezbollah dares to take all kinds of steps against Israel, the doomsday is going to come to Lebanon. And Hezbollah needs to show that it is able to stand in front of all this power and threats pointed at him. And it's very vulnerable and sensitive right now. We have to remember in this respect that Hezbollah basically has several identities that he has to somehow live with all of them simultaneously. And first and foremost, it's a jihadi organization. So it has to show that it operates as a jihadi organization. It has to, from time to time, shoot at Israelis or do some things that show that it is really committed to the struggle against Israel. And so this launching of the rocket is one of the missile is one way to say, I'm jihad. Jihad is my second name. And I haven't forgotten how to launch missiles and rockets. At the same time, it is an Iranian organization, and it is an Iranian identity. And it has to show its Iranian patrons that it is ready to help them if the situation with Iran deteriorates. And even though with the new administration in the United States, it seems that you don't hear very often that all options are on the table, but the potential of escalation with Iran, either with Israel or with the United States, is pretty growing in recent times, especially because of everything that Iran is doing in the context of its nuclear project. And Hezbollah has to show that it's ready, it's protecting itself. It has to show that the Iranians that they can rely on him if necessary. And this is another source of potential escalation in Lebanon. We don't know what's going to happen with Iran, but it's something that can happen. And on top of that, it has a Shiite identity, a Lebanese Shiite identity, that has to present itself as the protectors of the Shiite and those, the one who takes care of their needs. And it's not doing a good job recently because the Shiites themselves are unhappy with the situation in Lebanon. The deterioration of the value of the Lebanese pound and so on and so forth puts a lot of pressure on every Shiite, not only on every Lebanese and on every Shiite in this respect. And finally, Hezbollah has a Lebanese identity, as I said in the beginning. It has to present itself as the protector of Lebanon. And when Israeli aircraft is flying over Lebanon all the time, it puts it in an awkward position as the protector. And although every Lebanese knows that those Israelis flying over them are not carrying any attacks in Lebanon, but still it's a little bit embarrassing from Hezbollah's point of view that he cannot do anything about it. So all of these things put together Hezbollah in a position where it wanted to say something about its jihadic Iranian, Lebanese, and Shiite identities and prove that it is still committed to all of them. And this was a way of delivering this message in a way that would not cause necessarily a deterioration and escalation that it didn't want. That's in Lebanon. At the same time, we have the totally different rules of the game in Syria. In Syria, what's happening, and it's of course related, in Syria, what's happening is that Iran is trying to use Syrian territory in order to support Hezbollah with weapons that will improve its capability once there is a war between Israel and Hezbollah. And this war can erupt, as I said, also because something that is going to be related to Iran. If the Iranians are under pressure and they want to take steps against Israel in order to send a message to the Americans, this is also something that Hezbollah can be involved in. And the Iranians want to strengthen Hezbollah as much as they can. They do it through trying to improve its capability to hit targets in Israel with precision-guided munition. And they have a special project for that. And the way to deliver these weapons is through Syria. Now, you can ask, why don't they just deliver it directly to Lebanon? Especially as Hezbollah controls the Lebanese airport. But they don't do it because it's part of the rules of the game in Lebanon, that you don't deliver weapons to Lebanon directly. By the way, recently there were some direct flights from Iran to Lebanon, which is an open question what exactly these flights were carrying. But basically, this is not in the rules of the game to allow Iran to deliver weapons directly to Lebanon. And that's why they have to do it through Syria. And of course, when they do it through Syria, Israel also have air dominance and intelligence dominance in Syria. So in this attempt to prevent Hezbollah from getting too strong, we hit all these targets, or many of these targets, while they're still in Lebanon. Because the rules in Lebanon are such that Israel can carry out operations against Iranian infrastructure in Lebanon without worrying too much about the retaliation, neither from Hezbollah nor from the Syrians, and only to a very limited extent from the Iranians themselves. The Iranians keep threatening that they will retaliate, that they will do all kinds of things. They even tried twice or three times, but they never really did something extremely successful. And the Israeli intelligence dominance allows Israel to thwart most of these attempts before they even come to the level of implementation, point of implementation. So in Lebanon, we are allowed to carry out these operations, and we do it quite intensively, including this attack that I mentioned before, the day after the attack with the missile in Lebanon. And we also do it against two other targets that the Iranians are trying to promote in Syria. One is to turn Syria into an Iranian base that can be used in order to carry out attacks against Israel. So we operate against these kinds of infrastructure building in Syria. And especially at the same time, the Iranians are trying to build terror capabilities along the border in the Golan Heights, governed by people that are affiliated to them. And we are trying very hard to slow down the pace with which they are building these capabilities and to hit them from time to time. And these are three targets that we are operating against in Lebanon, in Syria, with limited retaliation threat. And so far, this has been going quite successfully. In recent months, for several times, Israeli military officials spoke about the success Israel has in this respect and the feeling that Iran understands that it has to limit its activities in Syria. I'm less optimistic, but maybe they know something I don't know. Anyhow, I don't see so far that Iran is subsiding its operations in Syria. They still very much committed to operate over there, to support Assad on the one hand, and to take advantage of this support in order to turn Syria into an Iranian base, promote its capabilities to harm Israel along the border, and keep trying to deliver weapons to Hezbollah through Syria. I'm afraid personally, I cannot substantiate it with information, but knowing the Iranians, knowing the Syrians, knowing how their cooperation goes along, I'm also afraid of the possibility that the Iranians are using Syrian territory to do all kinds of sensitive stuff that has to do with their nuclear project, all kinds of things that they cannot or they're afraid of doing in Iran. Until now they don't have to fear about sudden inspections, surprise inspections, but in the past, maybe they were a little bit more afraid, and they could have used all kinds of facilities in Syria in order to promote their activities over there. Who knows, Israel takes action against all kinds of facilities of the Iranians in Syria. Who knows, maybe these are also among those who are attacked. So these are the rules of engagement in Syria. But there is one exception. Hezbollah, according to these rules, have its operatives in Syria, many Hezbollah operatives in Syria. It has its operative in Syria exposed to Israeli fire. So while in Lebanon, the rules of the game are that Israel doesn't take action against Hezbollah, but just collect information, the rules of the game in Syria are such that Israel can take operations against Hezbollah activists. This is, I would say, Hezbollah is not very fond of this part of the rules. And they are in the midst of an attempt to change these rules. This specific rule they want to change. That Israel will not hit Hezbollah operatives, Hezbollah terrorists in Syria itself, especially those who are involved in this effort to bring the sensitive weapons that Iran is trying to deliver Hezbollah through Syria. So you want to hit the storage facility, you want to hit the truck that delivers it, fine. Don't kill our people there. So we have to be according to these new rules that Hezbollah is trying to promote. We have to be very careful and know exactly what's going on and make sure that no Hezbollah people are hit. Iranians, it's all right. Syrians, it's fine. But please don't hit Hezbollah people. So there was a case last July in which one Hezbollah person was hit and killed. And ever since then, Hezbollah is trying to retaliate, to deliver the message that even if he's hit in Syria, it shouldn't happen. And Israel, by the way, was most of the time quite aware of this rule and trying to avoid it. I don't know if you remember, but there was a case in which a car carrying weapons from Syria was on its way to Lebanon. It was getting closer and closer to the border crossing, and Israel wanted to hit the car, and but he didn't want to hit the people that were in the car. So there was a missile hit just a couple of meters ahead of the car. The car stopped. The two Hezbollah people left the car, and then Israel hit the car itself and exploded it. But the two Hezbollah operatives were saved. And but in this case, the other case, Hezbollah operative was killed, fortunately or unfortunately, nobody knows. And he was not of a very high level, mid-level operative. But nevertheless, Hezbollah decided to try and carry out a retaliation operation. It already tried twice, but without any success. And it says that it's still committed to do that, and I believe them. Usually they are quite reliable. And if they say so, they probably mean it. This, of course, can lead to some sort of escalation. But what Israel is doing is trying to let them feel that they did something without hitting Israelis. It's not easy. We did it last year successfully when there was something similar. We managed to somehow let them feel that they did something without us suffering any damage. They never realized if we did or we did not. This time we haven't reached this point because all the attempts to carry out this retaliation operation so far failed. This is the rules of the game in those two arenas. A totally different rule of the game situation is in Iran itself, where everybody can do whatever they want as long as they don't say that they did it. And that is the denial capability that stands there. And a lot of things are happening. Nobody knows who did what. And it's all right for everybody, because this enables everybody to keep playing according to the same rules of the game. The only thing Israel said it did was taking the archive of the nuclear project from Tehran. And since nobody got hurt in this operation, so it was something that the Iranians managed to live with even then. The logic behind that is that Iran feels itself very vulnerable, very exposed to all kinds of harsh measures by its enemies. And because of that, it prefers to lead wherever it can the conflict into some sort of low-level harassment conflict, rather than raising the gamble and take the possibility, face the possibility of harsh, wide-scale operation against its targets. It is very afraid that its facilities, especially nuclear facilities, will be hurt. And it had suffered some tasting capabilities of what can happen to it when Qasem Soleimani had to leave the scene. And then when Mr. Fakhrizadeh followed him to a world of that is all good. So it's they know to play the game in this respect. They prefer that everything will happen in Lebanon or in Syria, not in Iran itself. And that's the situation we are witnessing. Last word that I want to say is about the situation with Hezbollah after the last round of threats. So Hezbollah, Nasrallah had said, okay, I listened to you carefully. You say two things. One is that we should not hide our military and the terror assets in among civilians like we usually do, and that if we keep doing that, we should have to anticipate, we as Hezbollah, we should have to anticipate that when Israel attacks us, a lot of civilians will be hurt, and it's going to be a lot of civilian damage. So let me tell you, interestingly enough, he didn't say, no, this is not true. I'm not using civilian as human shields, and I'm not breaking the law of distinction, the rule of distinction between military facilities and civilian facilities. No, no, it's true. I'm using civilian facilities. But he said, you do that too. And look, in Israel, there are many facilities that are located in civilian areas and so on and so forth, which is nonsense. But still, it was an opportunity for Nasrallah to show that he can hit Israeli targets that are located near civilian targets, like the headquarters of the military in Tel Aviv and so on, Syria. And so this was one message. And the other message was that, yes, you can cause us a lot of damage, but we can cause you a lot of damage as well. And don't build on the assumption, as was stated by the Israeli intelligence, that any skirmish will be limited at least in time. Nobody can control it, so get ready for something really big and long, and don't think that you can control the length of a conflict. I think, yes, from Hezbollah point of view, he is deterred. He doesn't want a confrontation. He doesn't want escalation at this point of time, but he is investing a lot of effort in preparing itself to a long confrontation with Israel, in which it is going to be capable of hitting targets in Israel, in Israel's depths, and strategic targets in Israel. And it has, as you all know, something like 120, 150,000 rockets. This is an awful lot of rockets. Not all of them, only a few of them are precisely guided, but when you have so many rockets, even if they are not precisely guided, statistically they can cause quite a lot of damage. And as the chief of staff has said recently, and the head of our intelligence said, if there is going to be a confrontation, Israel is going to suffer a lot of pain as well. It's not only one side going to suffer, but the pain in Lebanon is going to be many times bigger than the one that we are going to suffer. And Nasrallah knows that, and that's why he's behaving himself until now. That's it for now, and I'm happy to answer your question.
Thank you, Yossi. We have questions. We have a lot of questions, actually. So we may not get to all of them, but thank you all for sending them. We will send them on to Yossi afterwards. In the meantime, let's start with what we have. One questioner says, you use the phrase rules of the game regarding Hezbollah, regarding Syria, regarding Iran. Does the idea of rules of the game imply stability where maybe there isn't stability? Is it possible that Israel will become complacent and think that they have a stable relationship where in fact there is no stability?
Well, first of all, there is some sort of strange stability. It's an unstable stability that we have and we are used to live with, because, you know, when you start speaking about Israel, the first thing you have always to say, it's complicated. So it's so this is also complicated. We have stability, and we didn't fight a war in the north since 2006. This, in Israeli terms, 15 years without a war is some sort of stability. And you know, the north part of Israel is flourishing, and the economy is doing extremely well, and so on and so forth. This is stability. Now, this stability has been always vulnerable. It's the possibility of escalation was always there, but both sides somehow managed to navigate very cautiously and to avoid escalation. By the way, even in 2006, if you remember, Nasrallah said, had I known that this is going to cause escalation, I wouldn't carry out the kidnapping that led to the escalation. So it's so even then he was not that interested in such a big escalation as we had in 2006, but he was prepared for that. And this is the situation ever since then. He's prepared for an escalation, so are we. But because of that, there is some sort of balance of preparedness he would say balance of deterrence. Well, I don't think we are deterred, but we just don't have any interest in that. We don't need to be deterred. We don't have any interest in escalation. He may have an interest in escalation, but he's deterred. We don't have an interest in escalation. We just do whatever is needed in order to keep him deterred. And that is the way we, both sides, operate in this situation. There were all kinds of attempts to limit the capabilities of Hezbollah, especially from within Lebanon. The Lebanese population understand that they pay a very heavy price for this situation, and they want to get rid of this grip that Hezbollah has over their lives. So far, they are not strong enough in order to do anything about it. Who knows? If the sanctions will go on, maybe there are going to be some change. I mean, in 2020 and 2019, people in Lebanon were courageous enough, to go out to the streets and carry out slogans against Hezbollah. They should be highly appreciated for their courage. And there is a real challenge for Hezbollah from within, and this is one of the sources of instability. It's not something we do. It's something that the fears that Hezbollah has from losing the home front. That's something that makes Hezbollah more edgy and more ready to take action.
Thank you. Question.
And by the way, in Syria, there's also stability. I mean, they don't shoot at us. It's, they are deterred. They are busy with other things. They lost a lot of their capabilities. So it's also some kind of stability, unstable stability that we have there as well. Also in Iran, I don't want to go into that. Yes.
Talking about stability in Syria, Israel talks to Russia a lot. Russia, in fact, coordinated the prisoner exchange last week, which was interesting. How much of what Israel talks to Russia about is deconfliction, which means just not shooting each other, and how much of it is really coordination of positions so that Russia gets something that it wants and Israel also gets something that it wants?
Well, most of it is deconfliction. The most important thing is deconfliction, because we saw that one case they lost a plane. So it's we have to be careful and make sure that nothing happens to the Russians in Syria because of what we're doing. And one of the things we are trying to convey to the Russians all the time in this context is that, listen, those Iranians, they know that we don't want to hurt you, so they try to put their assets next to your bases. Make sure that first of all, make sure that they are not there. But if you cannot make sure of that, at least make sure that they are not in your vicinity. And that message is being delivered again and again with all kinds of proofs, and we show them the proof that what the Iranians are doing. And we saw, for example, the Russians evacuated T4 recently, and they do all kinds of things to stay away from the Iranians. And so it's because deconfliction is important for us and for them as well. They don't like our operations in Lebanon, in Syria. Don't get the wrong impression. They would rather have us stay home, but we have to keep operating there, and they understand it without a lot of happiness. On top of that, we of course discuss ways of handling the situation in a more of its roots. In its roots, it's very difficult. Look, they are committed to this butcher from Damascus, and they cannot afford him losing power. They understand it's problematic. It's not that they don't know. We keep hearing it from time to time that they keep open channels to the opposition, that they run discussions with the Iranians, but also with the Turks, the Astana process, and other commitments they have in Syria. But so far, they remain committed to Assad, and they put pressure on him by releasing all kinds of fake news about them reconsidering their position and so on, to make sure that he behaves himself the way they want him to. But I haven't seen them giving up on him, and now they have all kinds of expectations to get involved in the reconstruction of Syria and so on and so forth, which they're competing with the Iranians a little bit. And so that's, I don't see them giving it up. And we cannot, although there are all kinds of rumors that I consider to be totally unsubstantiated about all kinds of some rapprochement between Israel and Assad. I think this is not logical. But Israel kept itself out of this business of who's going to rule Syria in the future. I think not that it wasn't the brightest of idea to keep ourselves out, but that's the way we decided to do, to handle this matter. And because of that, we don't interfere with their effort to keep Assad in power. And we don't operate against Assad. We do only what's necessary for us to do in order to protect ourselves. And there's understanding between us and the Russians that we are allowed to take action to protect ourselves as long as we don't endanger Assad and we don't endanger the Russian interest in Syria. And this goes on for what, more than 5 years now. So it's since they entered Syria.
So back to Lebanon. The United States provides arms and training to the Lebanese armed forces, the kind of official army of Lebanon. And our government, the American government, says that we do that because we need someone to protect the people of Lebanon. We need some institution that works for the people. How closely does the Lebanese armed forces work with Hezbollah? And does it mean that the United States is actually providing weapons and training that are being used ultimately? We don't train Hezbollah, but ultimately by Lebanese armed forces, people who do.
Well, first of all, Lebanese army is deeply involved in all kinds of relations with Hezbollah, deeply infiltrated by Hezbollah loyalists inside the army. And you know, the Lebanese army, first of all, is made of all walks of the society in Lebanon, including many Shiites. But beyond that, it is used to cooperate with Hezbollah, especially in the south, but not only in the south. So it's not new, and I'm sure that the American administration is aware of that and knows that. At the same time, I accept the idea that to maintain some sort of a structure called Lebanon, for whatever it stands for, you need to allow the Lebanese authorities to have some sort of military power that is mainly used to confront internal threats. And unfortunately, they have a lot of them. And these may be Daesh and all kinds of radicals in different areas, and other sorts of challenges that they face. That said, you don't have to arm them so much. It's basic arms are going to be enough for that purpose, and that's what we are worried about. It's when you give them special training and you give them some kind of advanced weaponry, that is the thing that we are worried about, because this may be used also to help Hezbollah when Hezbollah decides to do that. And when and if we reach a situation where the Lebanese state is separated from Hezbollah, then we have nothing against the Lebanese army, just like, you know, the army of Jordan gets a lot of weapons from the United States, so does the army of Egypt. And in both cases, we were ready to live with it. Lebanon is a different case.
So we're coming to the end of our time. I'm going to ask you just one more question. And it's a sort of funny question for us. So there are elections coming up in Israel. You're going to go to the polls again. I'm not going to ask you who's going to win. I'm not going to ask you what the composition of the Knesset will look like. But the question from our listener is, are there significant differences among the main parties and the main politicians about how the confrontation with Hezbollah and Lebanon and with Syria goes? Or would you say that across the political spectrum in Israel, there's a certain consensus about how to deal with Hezbollah and how to deal with Syria?
Well, there's no consensus on anything in Israel.
Okay, never mind that part.
But I would say that like 85%, close to 90% of the Zionist parties in Israel have the same opinion about the northern front, okay, about Iran, about Syria, about Hezbollah. All of them consider Hezbollah and Iran to be a major threat to Israel, and are committed to strengthen the deterrence capabilities towards it and to slow down its weaponization process and armaments, and to prevent Iran from having a nuclear capability. All of these things are almost consensual in Israel. Of course, if you ask the Joint List, they have a different opinion. But even, I would say, even merits are, I don't know, they don't actually speak very often about this issue. This is not something they are concerned with. But if they would have an opportunity to say something about it, I think that they would say the same thing. So this is agreed upon in Israel. There are differences of opinion about the Palestinian issue, but not on the issue of Hezbollah and the north.
So that's a great question for us to end on, because I always like to end on a question where the answer is positive. And I think if you have 80 or 85% consensus on something in Israel, that counts as a positive answer. So on behalf of our audience today, Yossi Kuperwasser, I would like to thank you for enlightening us, for helping us understand not only what is going on in Lebanon and Syria, but how Israel approaches those things. Thank you very much for your time and for the education.
Thank you, Shoshana. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, all the listeners. Thank you very much.